Hi, my name is Mona Jamshed, and I'm going to introduce you to a series of lectures on a software engineering course called Requirements Engineering. I delivered this course to a group of students of Bachelors of Software Engineering at University of Adelaide in the year 2022. This course covers the foundation of requirements specification of a software product. I had the course in different sections, and it started from understanding requirements specification, understanding the client's needs, analyzing those needs, testing and validation of those needs, prototyping, and management. The slides that I have used have originally been prepared by Professor Dagmar Monnet, who is a professor of computer sciences at the Berlin School of Economics and Law. She has very kindly provided these slides for teaching purposes and has also allowed the modification. So a slight modification has been done to suit the needs of the students. I've tried to teach this course in a very basic manner using everyday examples. I hope you enjoy this series and you're able to learn something about requirements engineering. Also, you will be seeing this clip at the beginning of each of the lectures that I'll be uploading under this lecture series. Happy studying.
All right. So yeah, so basically what we discussed in detail last week was the idea of what are good requirements, so basically the quality criteria. And we touched upon all the, I think there are 16 or 17 items for quality criteria. I'm just trying to find out the slide which had the entire checklist, but this is a good one as well. And yeah, this one. So what we are now, it says here on this that these definitions or this criteria has been developed by Chris Rupp and Sopis. So Chris Rupp, he's a software developer and he runs this consulting company. And in your course, this criteria was taken from there. And I don't think it's included in your course book, but yeah, if you want to have a look at his, there is like a rule book that Chris Rupp has published, which is all about the quality criteria for requirements. And basically they are all like these 16, 17 items listed there. And you can have a look there as well, like if you want to have a more theoretical read of what the requirements should be like. So I'm going to move on. So what where we ended last week was the user stories. And user stories actually is also, if you were present in this workshop session last Tuesday, it was something that we discussed in detail as well. We invited the groups to come up and with their version of user stories, and there was a lot of discussion and conversation going on as to how we can improve them. So for now, I think I'm going to just sort of pick up some momentum. I'm going to start off again with what we discussed about user stories, and then I'm going to move on to the today's particular session about specification. Now, in case of user stories, what we discussed was that it's an important part of the Agile project approach. It's good that we had a paper presentation on Agile approach today, and so the main crux of Agile based projects is open communication, is a lot of conversation between the team members as to how they can work and rework on improving the requirements. So, sorry, I have a bad throat. User stories, what we discussed last time was that they're used to describe, they are basically a very simple description of a product feature, right? And these stories are written in a very simple language, easy to understand, literally like a story from the user's point of view, right? So they replace, so they basically tell the stories all about that, what the team should build and deliver based on what the user requirements are, right? So user stories, they basically, there's a product backlog where they are put according to the prioritization of the requirements. So the stories that are based on requirements which are of high value will always be put first, and they will be worked on first, and so on. So it's really important that your user story is compelling, it's interesting, it is correct, in order to correctly portray the requirement as well. And it's basically what you should focus on is, they say that not the how, but who the requirement, the user, who the user story is for, what is going to be, what the story is about, and why it's being done. So a good few tips that you can use for writing a good user story is that you can actually put yourself in this shoes of your customer, and then you see and ask yourself that what is the value that the customer wants to derive out of a certain requirement, right? So there's this example that I read. It was like, and it's an okay user story example. It would be like, I want the system that I'm building to be stable because that's what I expect as a customer. So this is telling me a little bit about what the customer's desire is, and that his desire is for a stable system. But if you just change it to, like, because the setup of your client is such that their employees are like spread all over the world and they are working in different time zones. So you can say that because my employees work in different time zones at all hours and around the clock, so I want the system to be stable. Now, as a product owner, when you read this kind of a user story, you have a much clearer and better idea of what and why the requirement is the stability requirement is asking for. So basically, yeah, once you have like a clear vision of what the requirement is asking for, it can also help you talk to your developer team as to how you can sort of measure that requirement, and that measurement can be part of the acceptance criteria of the user story, and I'm going to talk about that later. So basically what you begin with is who the user story is for, like who is the customer involved, who are the people and the entities for whom you're writing this functionality, what is their situation, like, so what are the environment that they work in, so because that will tell you about their priority. And coming back to like who your customer is, it's not important that there's just one customer. There can be like more than one customer. So if I take an e-commerce website example, a customer can be your a business partner who is sort of, who wants his he wants to drive the traffic to his retail site. But another customer would be like a shopper like me, who has just who's accessing that e-commerce site to find a product. So yeah, user story is very much based on who the customer is and what their needs are. So another important thing in user story is that you focus on what and not how. Like you focus on that, okay, what would a shopper on an e-commerce website want, and not how he wants it. So the user story is not going to talk about the technical details behind it, but a very simple way of expressing a shopper's requirement for accessing this, what is it called? The e-commerce site would be that as a frequent shopper, for example, like as a frequent shopper, I want to buy something with just one click so that I can buy without hassle. The requirement the story should not be like that. As a frequent shopper, the shopper should, the website should be able to sort of maintain like a profile of all the shoppers' payments data, so that they can do the shopping in one click. So that's telling you about the how, right? And that's not what the user story is about. The user story should only focus on the what of the requirement. What exactly does the customer want from that requirement? So we then went on to the definition that is given in your course book. And as it says, that it's an important part of the agile projects. And they're usually in the form of 1 or 2 sentences. And they describe basically the user's needs, as well as the motivation behind fulfilling that need. Why does the user want, what's the benefit that the user is going to get from fulfilling that functionality? So, so what happens in a user story is that we write this 1 or 2 line simple description, and then we come out with conversations. Now, these conversations are really important, and they are part of what we call the story card that I'm just going to open now. The story card is basically, it's just like your post-it note. So what happens is that you write a user story on a post-it note, a very simple description, and then you discuss with your team members. You start conversations with them that what to flesh out more details. So these conversations are really important. Why? Because they help you keep in mind how much time and resources would it take to fulfill that requirement. Okay, so in the slide here, you can see that that's the front of a story card is basically the user story itself, and then some conversations that how you want that requirement to be fulfilled. So here the description is that a company can pay for a job posting with a credit card. Now, some of the details that you would like to discuss with your team members is that what kind of cards we are going to be accepting. And for the user interface, for example, we don't have a field for card type, so it can be derived from the first 2 digits on the card. So from a very simple story-like description, you come out with further conversations to ensure that you are able to confirm the story, the user story. Now, normally it's said that there are 3 C's in a user story. Number 1 is the what's it's called, the card itself, which is the description, the user story itself. And then there is something called the conversation that we just discussing. And then there is something called the confirmation. So after you have sort of discussed the conversations, you go, the confirmation is the back of the story card, where you're talking about how we are going to test that user story. Confirmation is actually basically both the conversation and the confirmation are part of the acceptance criteria. So in the acceptance criteria, you are focusing on how you are going to test the user story and how you are going to do a demo of that requirement to the client. So that's how the story card, the user story works. They have a very fixed syntax. It's not something that you can, you should be following, but then it basically begins with like, as a user, I want to, then you write an action, you want to do what, and then so that you basically describe your, what is called, your motivation, your need. So like as a, like a passenger, I want to do an online check-in so that I'm able to board my flight quickly. So things like that, or even I'll take another example like we discussed last week as well, that as an Uber user, I want to have an access to the cars around, like around the area that I'm in, so that I can call the closest driver. Now, while this is a really simple description of the user's requirement, but a lot of conversations can come out of it that can help you with testing of the user story. So maybe when it comes to conversation, you can talk about, okay, so how will we define the area? Like, would it be, so you can put a numeric to it, like wherever I am, Uber drivers within 4 kilometers range where I am at the moment. So things like that. So just fleshing out more descriptions so that your demo of that user story becomes possible. There's another slide which is basically it's an acronym that they have used in order to describe a good user story, and it's called the INVEST. So they say that for a good user story, it's important that the user story is independent. Now, independence here means that when you are writing a user story, you don't have any dependence on another user story for that matter. And the team can work on it independently without having to sort of depend on another user story. So independence is a key criteria for a good user story. Let me just have a look at. Yeah, so somebody just asked that if the slides are available on my uni. Yes, it's the same. It's the same file that I had uploaded last week as well. So I'm just taking it on from there. Okay, so they need to be independent, and then N is for negotiable. And as it says, something that is negotiable, it should be open to conversations. It should be open to change. It should be open to being adapted. So basically, like if you're product owner, as a product owner, you come and discuss a user story with your team, and you bring this story card to them, and during conversations you come up, your team comes up with a better idea. So the user story needs to be flexible. It can change and adapt to further enhance the chance of fulfilling the user's requirement. So N is like it's negotiable. V is valuable. Obviously, the main crux of a user story is providing value to the user, right? A user story has to provide some concrete value to the user. So, for example, if you're making an app and like a user story can even be based on the need or on a requirement of the user, that the users may say that there is no way that they can sort of investigate or track their transactions on the app. So you, along with your team members, can like they can discuss that now this is a need of the user there, and how can we work on improving this need, and in the process we are providing more value to the client. So when we talk about delivering value to the client, what we are basically doing is we are reducing the gap between the user's expectation, what they had initially requested for, and what we deliver. So it's important that a good user story is valuable, estimable. So basically, yeah, you should be able to know how much time and resources a user story will take. So if it's a complex user story, you should be able to put a time frame to it. So it's basically you need to know that it's estimatable. Small is it should be like small enough now as compared to a use case, which can be a collection of of many user stories. A user story is small, and it can be like it should be able to finish within a few days, and then obviously a good user story is one that is you're able to test it and you're able to do a demo in front of your clients. So it should also be testable. So we are going to continue working on this concept in the next workshop. So I highly encourage all the students that they attend next week's workshop so that we are able to work on it. No matter how much I talk in theory about user story, unless and until we don't do practice, and we are not going to be able to refine our skills in making a good user story. And this is what we observed even in the last week's workshop. So you may like to add this as part of your SRS document, which is a deliverable that you have to provide at the end of your semester. So I highly encourage you to come and work on some exercises based on user story in next week's workshop. Okay, now we are now going to move on to part 2 of requirements specification. If there are any questions, please let me know before I move on. Okay, I believe I can move on then. All right, so requirement specification part 2. Today, what we are going to discuss is not something new. It's just a template that is going to help you come up with good quality requirements. Now, we had already discussed in theory the quality criteria for requirements last week, right? So all those 16, 17 rules are part of Chris Rupp's consulting company, and that's what he came up with some requirements. Now, if your project asks for this kind of template to be used, you can go ahead and use it. I'm just going to discuss because according to Chris Rupp, this template is like a blueprint which helps with the, so basically you're going to work today, you're going to learn about how the syntax of writing a good requirement. You learned theoretical quality criteria of a good requirement, and today we are just going to touch upon the syntax that is required to make the requirement more unambiguous, more testable, and complete. So basically, yeah, it's like if you're looking for a concrete method to write a requirement, that's something that you can follow. Okay. So yeah, constructing perfect requirements in 6 steps. And we also discussed another document last week, and that in the workshop, and that was pearls from sand. So that's like a sample document, like a document that you can reference to fill in your SRS document. And now in the pearls from sand document has some practical application of this template that we are going to discuss today. So you can have a look under the heading of user requirements of how they have put in the requirements there. But yeah, coming on to what that syntax is, let's move on and discuss it. It's basically based on like what a noun, a verb, and an adjective, right? So let's talk about the first step. Now, step 1 says that determine the process which the requirement will denote as a requisite. Identify the desired functionality. Now, this basically in simple English means that you need to, in order to identify the functionality of the requirement, you need to use a verb. And a verb, you know, is an action. So basically you are going to identify the action to show the functionality. Nothing more than that. Yeah. Here the examples are. So what exactly do you want the system to do? Do you want the system to print, to transmit,
to save, to calculate, right? And this step obviously is the most important step for writing requirements, your action words, right? Your action words are going to identify the functionality of the requirement. So that's step one. Now, step two is use process words to describe the process. So that means along with an action word, you describe the process. So it is like, if the action word is insert, the verb that we used is insert. The example is the system inserts new data. Or if you're selecting the functionality is select, the user selects one element of a finite set. So here you're just discussing the, you're including process words to describe the process. Number three is that you reduce the number of process words to the words actually relevant to the system. So sometimes, like in our English writing, we sometimes we use a lot of verbs which have more or less the same meaning. But when you're writing the requirements, just be careful to stick with one verb that gives the meaning that you want to provide, like the functionality, just using one verb. So for example, you don't use enter, input, and insert in different parts of your requirement documentation. You just stick to one of them, and then that is what you use throughout your documentation. So just to bring some more fluency in the requirements. And I think when you're working on large projects, it's really important that the syntax is as simple and easy to comprehend as possible. So yeah, step one tells you about including an action word, the word to discuss the functionality, and then using a process word to describe the process, and then sticking to one verb action to describe your process. Step two is you move on after like describing the action word, you then move on to the next stage, which is the system is going to provide that functionality like independently, or does it need some, like an interface to work on? So is it an independent system activity? Which is like the system prints. So, okay. Or it says that provide with whom the ability, like with whom do you want to, the system should print. So the example should be the system should provide the receptionist to with the ability to print. So the system is not doing the activity independently. It's basically relying on a user who is going to provide the functionality of the system, which is the print. So in order to print, we need a receptionist to do that print command. And then it says, is it an interface requirement? So the system executes a process dependent upon a third party. So basically the system is performing an action, that is the print command, but what is the functionality in the particular requirement? So here the example is like the system is able to receive the data from the library. So here the functionality that they are is able to receive, right? And that functionality is dependent on what? On an interface, on a third-party interface, and that is from the library. So when you identify an action, you also have to see whether it is completely independent, it can be done independently, or it's relying on a user, like we just said in the last example. It's the print is relying on the receptionist, and sometimes you can even see that it's relying on an interface, on a third-party interface. In this case, it's the library.
data. Sorry, it's the library. Sorry, it's the data from the library. Okay. All right. Now, yeah, so another important, interesting aspect of writing requirements is how the use of words is going to put you in a legal obligation to fulfill that requirement. So last week, we had a paper presentation on open source softwares, right? And by definition, open source software projects are basically, they have no legal obligation. Whether you do fulfill a requirement or you don't do, no one is going to ask you, and you're not going to be legally binded. But if you go back to this slide, it says that in order to write a good requirement, there may be a legal relevance involved. So the use of modal verbs like shall, should, and will, they can bind you in a sort of a legal obligation that here, for example, it says, the example is the system shall provide the receptionist with the ability to print. Now, shall here is a very strong word here. It means that the functionality must be there in the system. It must provide the receptionist with the ability to print. So by using the word shall, what you are now legally obliged to your client to fulfill this requirement. Okay. So these modal verbs, like they have shall, should, and will. I'm going to discuss in the next slide that what should and will does, but basically shall binds you in fulfilling that requirement. All right. So let's look at the legal obligation, which is the degree of obligation that the stakeholders attach to the statements. So we discussed that shall is like legally binding. You are must to fulfill that requirement in the system. But then there's the word should. Now, should is like more of a what I call like a desirable requirement. If the requirement is written as that the system should provide the receptionist with the ability to print, it means that the requirement has no legal obligation to it. It's more of a suggestion. It's more of a desirable functionality that the system may have, right? So it's, yeah, as it says here, the degree of obligation against the word keyword should is nice to have it. It's good if it's there, but if it's not, then that's okay too. And the next keyword that we're using here is will. The modal verb is will. So will is like, it's basically denotes like a future functionality. So you see, if you read, it says here, the degree of obligation against the keyword will is the aim of the system, the intention or the future developments. So the client will be okay if it's not there, and it's something that they have desired to have it in the future. So yeah, so you see how the use of these words, according to Chris Rupp's template, can actually put the product owner and his team under some sort of legal binding as well. That's why, you know, like when you are going to write your user requirements, just be very careful. They have to be, the keywords, the use of these keywords has to be based on what was discussed with the users, on what they require during the requirement elicitation phase. It all goes back there. And that is going to help you define whether you're going to use the keyword shall, should, or will. All right. Will, it's something for the future. Should is a suggestion, a desire, and shall is mandatory. It's binding, legally obliged to fulfill that. Okay, so yeah, so this is another like a method which just helps you identify the requirements that you should work on, like when you are prioritizing your requirements during the analysis phase. So it's the acronym MOSCO. It's for M is for like must, S is for should, could have, and won't have. Yeah, so moving on. Now we move on. Now that we have, basically touched upon the basic syntax of the requirement, we add some more complexities to it, and let's see what are some of the other things that we can add to a requirement. So we have basically said that requirement has to begin with an action word. It needs to have someone like a user or an interface to interact with, and it should be able to, there should be a process involved in it to fulfill that functionality. And then we talked about the use of modal verbs, shall, should, and will, how they can change the you're legally bound to fulfill the requirements by the use of these modal verbs. Now we are going to further fine-tune them, and we are going to see that which objects and complements we can find, that which objects and complements are missing, something that we can add with our action word. The example is like the system shall provide the receptionist with the ability to print a bill on the network printer. So simple as it is, an object has been put with a verb. So the system is going to is going to provide the receptionist with the ability, and the object is to, with the ability to print a bill. The object added is the network printer. So we are just fine-tuning the requirement. The slide is just showing that how you can, work on your requirement in order to make it as unambiguous as possible, in order to make sure that you're not missing out anything. So another thing that you can do is adding a condition before the requirement. So maybe the nature of the requirement is such that it can only be fulfilled under certain conditions. So what we do is that we associate that condition with it when we are writing that requirement. So it says that which condition or prerequisites need to be met before for your requirement to be valid. And you place them in front of the requirement. So the example would be, if the option bill required has been selected on the mobile device, the system shall provide, and then comes the rest, shall provide the receptionist with the ability to print a bill on the network printer. So I hope it's easy for you to comprehend that we are just adding like more and more layers to it, just to make the requirement as clear, correct, and unambiguous as possible. And here what we have done is that if this option is selected, then the action is going to take place, right, on a particular object and all that stuff. So the system shall print if the option bill required is there. Okay. Okay. Use a Sophist rule book to ensure completeness of the semantic meaning. So the rule book, you can have a look, it's available online as well. I mean, there are like 17, 18 rules, but then again, they are just based on the quality criteria of requirements that we discussed last week, right? That they need to be correct, they need to be unambiguous, they need to be concise and consistent and valid, testable. So all these rules that we discussed last week, they are basically the rules, the rule book. And so it says here that apply the rules and the tests from the Sophist set of regulations. I think I can see if we can do an activity based on SOFIST rules next week. But then again, I'm not binding you to use it. It's just that if you think, for example, for this project, for this course, the project that you have chosen, if you think that this is something that's going to help you, you can go ahead with it and use it. And obviously, the things that they're talking about are just the what define, like they're providing you with a template of what a good quality requirement is to be written like. So it says avoid incomplete information. Now, a bad example that they're given is that customers who are not authorized are displayed. Now, this is a very, as you can see for itself, from a very ambiguous requirement, raising many questions and confusions. And that's certainly not what we want to do. So in this example, like customers who are not authorized are displayed, there's confusion about what is to be displayed, how, to whom it is to be displayed, and when. So I hope that we have this understanding while writing the requirements that ambiguity is one thing that we should not be adding in our, as we are writing the requirements down. So avoid any kind of incomplete information. Everything needs to be, any user, for example, when you hand it over to your developers team, they should be crystal clear as to what is happening, how it is going to be done. And, like the what, who, how, when, it should be clear about the requirements. Because if it's vague, then obviously it can't go further to develop and to test and all that. So the other thing that they use is that in order to ensure a complete semantic meaning of a requirement, they need to avoid falsifying reality. So for example, the system shall allow for archiving. Now, what here, there's a lot of like there's nothing clear about this action archiving, like what exact process is meant by it. So when you write your requirement, again, the message behind this is that try not to have ambiguity. There's a lot of information that is missing in this example, right? So sometimes we even write requirements which are quite open to understand. Now, for example, if your client had said that he wants the user interface of his application to be beautiful. Now, when you are talking, it can mean, like this is a very open-ended. What does beautiful mean to your user, and how do you interpret beautiful? So you may say that maybe having a light background on the app will make it more beautiful, or maybe something else. So just try to make your requirements as clear and as unambiguous as possible, so that you are able to avoid statements which, as it says, which are distorting the user's needs in the first place. So as it is, the user, we are all doing this effort to sort of satisfy the user's need and to make sure that we are able to provide them with a functionality that they can fulfill their requirement. And by including statements that are distorting, we are not going to achieve that objective. So another one is, generalization. Avoid generalization. So for example, if the requirement is displaying the data, now this is just such a generalized statement. What fields need to be attached to this requirement? How does the client want the data to be displayed? So for example, the data, a bad example here is that the data has to be graphically displayed to the user. So, and this raises questions like, which data exactly are we talking about here, and to what users do they want that data to be displayed? So again, just what we are talking about is make them as clear, as correct, as unambiguous as possible. And I think a very good way of working on your project is also actually a good opportunity for you to exercise this skill, and just make sure that when you're writing your requirements, you have that criteria right in front of you, and discuss within the team members. Now, that's a really important thing, that when you're having conversations in agile approach, especially when you're having these conversations with your team. So maybe you're a product owner, but when you go to your developers, you can come up with so many, during the course of your conversations, you can come up with so much detail that can help you ensure that there's completeness in your requirements, and they are easy for your developers team to work on, and is exactly what the users had asked for initially. So yeah, that's basically what the SOAPist rulebook was about. So just summarizing what we have discussed, the 6 steps involved in this template. Number 1 is you first determine an action word, right? That action is going to identify the functionality. So basically a verb followed by the process involved. So what process words you're going to use, how that action word is going to characterize the activity of the system. Number 3, and number 2, it involves things like who you're going to interact with, and whether it's a user or it's a third-party interface that is going to work with your action word. And then we talked about the use of modal verbs, how the use of shall is putting you in a legal binding to fulfill that requirement, that functionality. And we also discussed about should, which is something that is desirable, and will is something that you may like to have not in the present release, in the first release of the system, but maybe in the future releases. And then we talked about, so after defining an action word, we talked about adding an object. So what is the word going to act, or any object that it needs to perform that functionality. So we are further fine-tuning the requirement. And then we are talking about any conditions that, what are the conditions? Are there any conditions that need to be fulfilled first in order for the requirement process to occur? So under what conditions should the requirement be fulfilled? So yeah. Okay, so that's basically it for this session. And we're just going to wind up good practices of requirement specification. We discussed this last week as well. So basically we talked about the templates. What is the product scope and vision template for to record all your business rules separate from the project's requirement. And we also talked about identifying the requirement origins to ensure that all stakeholders know why requirement is needed. And all of these good practices are actually linked to the good practices of your requirement elicitation and your analyses. And specifying the non-functional requirements, that's something that we focus a lot on in our requirement elicitation. So in the initial phase of your requirement elicitation, you can gather a lot of information from your client on the non-functional requirements. And then as you move on with your specification, you can, they are like a necessary part of your SRS document. So the takeaway, again, this is the quality criteria for the requirements. this is what we have discussed today as well. So if you like to follow like a syntax to fulfill the quality criteria, that's what we have discussed today. The RAPS template, it's called. So yeah, that's all for today. So we this was our the second half of the specification, and we have sort of today wrapped up the specification phase of the requirement engineering, and we're going to move on next week. But what we are going to just, thank you. What we are going to just, I just want to encourage all of you is that practice writing the requirements or practice writing your user stories, and come up in the workshops and discuss with us or with your team members, because that's a really good way of learning. Yeah. All right. I'm going to stop the recording, and I'm going to see you next week on Monday again. Thank you.